And even though everybody has a newfound love for the national anthem, which is a Bangla song, by the way, and most of the Delhi's newsreaders can't pronounce Kanimuri, though they can pronounce very complicated French names. Great, a warm welcome to you. As Borges once pointed out, there is one word you will not find in the Quran, which is the camel. And he pointed out that the reason why you will not find the camel in the Quran is that the Arabs who wrote it didn't need to mention it. It was all around. There were just too many camels. I'm sure there was no sand also mentioned. So the question of interpretation didn't come up. It was such an authentic book that it didn't need some elements to tell its story. But in today's world, how sacred is authenticity? Does literature and journalism and art require it as much as some people claim they do? So are people who are, yeah, hi Ajay. Hi. What about writers who are not in a position to be authentic? Don't they have a right to deal with subjects that they want to, but they don't belong to? How much should a writer know to write? I know that this question would terrify journalists. Do you need to know anything to write about a subject? You know? So let's see what a wonderful panel of speakers have to say. Yassmin, a few months ago, you created a lot of trouble. There was Shriver who was giving a speech in Australia, and she was defending her right to talk about things she may not be a master of, and she said that the authenticity is part of cultural policing, and that the fringe does not belong to the fringe alone, minorities don't belong to minorities alone. Writers have a right to write about anything they want, and you were so disgusted that you walked out. You got up and walked out. First of all, do you regret that action?
Well, I mean, it got me here, right? So I think, so I'll set the scene for those who aren't aware. There was the opening keynote for a speech in Brisbane, which is my hometown, and the theme of the festival was connection and belonging, right? I was the only Australian writer of colour in the audience, of a couple of hundred. There was one other writer of colour in the audience, who is a Korean American. And a lady got up, a white American middle-aged lady got up and essentially said, I don't really care what other people feel about their cultures because I'm a writer and I write fiction and I have the right to write whatever I want, whatever I please. Now, anyone can write whatever they want. The question is about intention for me. Because if the question was, how do we best write authentically other people's experiences? How do I, as a writer, put myself in other people's shoes in a way that respects other people's experiences? That's an interesting conversation. But if somebody says to me, I don't really care what you feel, I don't really need to care what you feel, I'm going to come in, take your culture, do with it what I want, take your experience, bastardize it, and then profit from it, and how dare you say that I can't? Well, excuse me, I've had a lifetime of people telling me that I should shut up because I'm a woman, because I'm brown, because I'm Muslim in a Western context. I've had a lifetime of people telling me that I don't have the right to be anything because of freedom of speech. But apparently freedom of speech doesn't go both ways. Apparently her freedom of speech was more important than my freedom to say something opposite. And here's the other really fascinating thing about political correctness. The only people, I was born in Sudan. Political correctness is if you say the wrong thing, you get killed for it. I didn't do anything to Lionel Shriver. She can continue writing what she wants. She'll continue making money, right? But really, when we think about who has the right to say what, I think it comes down to intention and context and respect. Because at the end of the day, somebody coming in who's already taken, when you sort of put it in the context of colonization, taken money, taken land. They also want to take identity. We have nothing left and they want to take our identity, and they want to make money from my own identity or anybody else's identity, and they want us to shut up about it. Well, back in the day, people without power people without power have always had reduced opportunity to have a voice. But we live in a time where I think, fortunately, potentially, we do have an opportunity to say, well, actually, that's not good enough.
So what are the subjects that you would not cover as a fiction writer, let's say? What are the cultures, what are the characters that you would deny the right to yourself to cover?
So I think, I mean, it's a really fascinating question, because that is more about self-policing than it is about somebody else telling me I can't write. Personally, I choose not to write about other cultures that I feel are more marginalized than my own, and whether that's a case of ethnic, cultural, class, or indigenous, or so on, because I think it is more powerful for me to use my platform to amplify their voices than it is for me to deign that my voice is more important, that I need to translate what they're saying. Because real empowerment is not about me telling somebody else's experience. Real empowerment is about saying, I realize I have privilege, let me empower you, let me share that privilege with you so that you can tell your own story.
Okay. Using your logic, I want to ask you now, the Indian feminist movement, and like most feminist movements, are elitist movements. Do they have a right to talk about poor women, where poor women have more in common with poor men?
Ooh.
And does the Indian feminist movement has the right to keep class out of feminism?
Very poignant question. I think feminist movements across the world have definitely benefited from class. If you look at the suffragettes movement, it was also when you think about intersectionality, a movement that was quite racist. And if you look at various feminist movements around the world, like lots of Muslims don't identify with a Western feminist movement because they see the sort of intersections of faith and culture and race come into it. I don't know enough about the Indian feminist movement to comment, and I think it would be very presumptuous of me to do so. But what I will say is that it is important for feminists, and it is important for anybody who is advocating for any sort of progress for a marginalized group, to make sure that in doing so they don't oppress others, right? And it's extremely difficult to think that potentially you, as somebody who is oppressed, may be an oppressor for others. So it is constantly about us checking our own privilege. I recently went through an experience where in sort of doing some advocacy for women and people of color, I inadvertently made things inaccessible for people with disabilities. And I had to sort of face the situation where people said, hey, I know you're advocating for a good thing, but what you're actually doing is oppressing somebody else by doing so. So constantly us recognizing that we don't have the experience, we don't have the right to say X, Y, Z, but we also do have a platform, and it is this thing about allyship and sharing of privilege is important, because as a woman, for example, I do need men as allies in a feminist movement. I don't want them to speak for me, but I do need allyship, right? So it is about women who do benefit from class providing allyship to women who don't.
Yes. Mrinal, would you like to add to this strand of the discussion?
Well, basically, the way I feel, you write out of integrity, not loyalty. Because in our time, the writer as somebody living in an isolated ivory tower is an idea which does not really exist for me. But when you come out of the ivory tower, are you holding a white flag or are you holding a tract, is what makes a certain writer interesting to me. And I would hate for anyone to impose a notion of solidarity on me as a writer. If I write out of a sense of my integrity, either supporting something or not supporting something. So Most of the time, I would support a lot of what women's movement is about, but where it militates against my sense of integrity, I would not allow loyalty for me to go on supporting it. I'll just give a small example. For example, for a long time I felt that the language divide between feminists or women who believe in the essential theory of feminism needs to be sorted out first. Because what goes on in India and what goes published outside as the viewpoint of Indian feminists or feminist publishing houses is essentially the viewpoint of women who are armed with an excellent education and who can communicate in English. But there are a whole host of women who have very important views, but their views are not being inducted in this little circle primarily because they do not have the language. Everybody wants shortcuts and quickies. They don't have the time to sit down and translate or the time to sit down and understand. And if that were to happen, I think feminism would acquire many more colors. Many years ago, I belong to a generation which has seen things change from day to day, year to year, decade to decade. And many years ago, there was this gathering of women on 8th of March in somewhere in New Delhi. And I noticed that there were no women who did not speak English, and there were no women from right-wing parties, and there were no women who worked on the streets. And I pointed it out to the organizers, and I felt that this is creating vacuums which you will find very hard to fill. And I was sitting right at the back, which is my usual perch, and there were a whole lot of women sitting there. They had been brought in more as showpieces. These were street vendors and panchayat heads and women who were working with their hands for their daily wages. And these women were sitting with me, and I struck conversation with them while all this high discourse was going on in English. And I said, "Aapko kaisa lag raha hai? How do you feel about the whole thing?" So one of them smirked and said, "The only thing I see common with them is that they smoke cigarettes and we smoke beedis." And it had several meanings, apart from the fact that those days smoking within halls was permitted. So now, they would all be more unified because none of them will smoke. But there was a kind of a sadness in what they said, because these were the women. They said, "हमको पता है हमारे बारे में बात हो रही है, लेकिन क्या बात हो रही हमको नहीं पता." We know that they are talking about us, but we don't know what they're talking about. So I think there are lacunae in the feminist movement. They are being bridged. To be fair, they are being bridged. The second incident is a group of us got together some 25 years ago when we were all much younger, and we felt that the press club in New Delhi left much to be desired for us. We needed a watering hole of our own. So about 18 of us senior women journalists, I was senior even then. So we pooled in some money, and then we set up the Indian Women's Press Club, the first press club for women in the country. And we invited membership. We have a thriving membership. And then slowly, I was the founder president, and over the next decade, I slowly eased myself out, because I believe that the next generation must take over, and if they want change, let them have change. And let them have change as they want it. Let them not follow our notions. Let's not impose false heroes and false ideologies on them. Let them change the way. But today I had a mail from a friend, one of the founder member friends. She said that they have just decided to include a clause in the act that we had formulated. It has been revised several times, but the latest has been an inclusion of a clause which says that the club will not indulge in any activity which is not considered national or write about matters which militate against the notion of a nation or its symbols. Now that to me, that militates against my integrity. So if I rebel against a group that I founded, it will be not because my loyalty is less, but my integrity is much more demanding and much more unshakable. So I think you are right. There are many areas in which we constantly keep questioning ourselves because we had no role models. We even had to ask ourselves, what is it that we want? You know, Freud had been asking it, but hang him. You know, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want? And even more than that, what do men want? I mean, why is there this divide? So I think this questioning goes on, and my takeaway from this whole lifelong experience is that in the end, let integrity stay with you. Let loyalty be subsumed by integrity if needed.
Yassmin, I know that you've been trying to, so very briefly before I move to Ajay, but please go ahead.
I mean, I think it's so, I'm inspired by your words. And I guess a question that I have around integrity and authenticity is what happens when you were one of the people that was sitting at the back not understanding what they were talking about, but understanding that they were talking about you. And by becoming involved, you become one of them. So say, for example, my childbirth, or growing up, I was in a certain class in society. And then because I started being given opportunities, social mobility meant that I'm now in a different class. Do I still have the right, is it still authentic for me to talk about something that I don't live?
We'll come back to that. But
Okay.
We'll come back to
Ajay, you write about Dalits. You're a Dalit writer. You're sitting next to a guy whose first novel had a Dalit protagonist. And one of the criticisms I received was that, what do you know about Dalits? I know you need to be a Dalit to write a Dalit character, which I don't agree with. But I would like to know your opinion. Do you think only Dalits can write about Dalits and express the Dalit experience?
Thank you, Manu. First of all, actually, I apologize. I was late. It was a wonderful night yesterday, and in the morning I couldn't get up at time. I took a tight sleep, so I'm sorry for that. First of all, and as Yassmin said, and Mrinal Pande ji said, I'm agreed with both of you to some extent. Actually, I think as Yassmin said, I've been in Melbourne at Monash University in this April 2016, last year. And there was a big conference, Dalits and indigenous writers. And the first time I saw that not only in India there are 2 or 3 India exist in the Indian state, quote unquote, but in Australia also there are 2 Australias in one Australia. Indigenous, the condition, the poor system for them, the harsh behavior for them, the discrimination. I felt I intimated by the people, And the question, as Manu said, I have written some points because I don't want to take much time for this. So please tolerate with me. As we all know that writing is not only an intellectual artistry. Yes, it is. But it is only the superstructure. But it is also deeply involved in its base which is strongly attached with social belongingness and commitments, as Mrinal Pande. When she was talking about that lady, yes, they are talking about us, but what they are talking, we don't know. In the same way, Dalit communities, tribals were asking, yes, the mainstream, quote unquote, so-called mainstream was writing for Dalit and tribal, but the ratio, but the percentage of their writing was very minimal in Hindi. The social culture or gender belongingness proved that mindset of a writer. I belong to a particular community, and Manuji has different social belongingness, maybe. As a intellectual artistic action, they can write. We cannot deny, but the problem arises when they claim, then we can write better than you. You sit, tell your experiences to us, and we will write for you. Yes. Because when you write, it is very unrefined, very raw, and we cannot relish this. We cannot enjoy as a literature. Then the question of representation arises. The question of claim become more stronger. So, if we talk about Premchand, Jagdish Chandra, मृणाल जी जानती हैं, हिंदी के सभी लेखकों को आप लोगों में से, I think some people do not know, and Amritlal Nagar ji, we should ask that how much of their writing depicted Dalit, minorities, women, tribals, and their consciousness and for their rights. What is the percentage? The mainstream literature has focused mostly on its middle class and its problems. You can see it from the 1857 to 2016. They are dealing with only middle class problems and issues. When Mrinal Pande is writing, she is writing for not only for women, she is also writing for rural women. This is good. A Dalit is not writing only for middle class, just a thin layer of middle class is emerging. And I am very much, I should say, and I think I was expecting Pawanji here because he has written a book, The Great Indian Middle Class, and you will not find a single Dalit, single tribal or any marginalized voice in that middle class, that Indian middle class.
Which is true. We are also,
okay.
I just moved to Mark, just an observation. We live in a country where journalism still has a hierarchy, where the air crash is supposed to be more important than a train accident. It really doesn't matter if 1,000 people have died in a train accident, but in the hierarchy of news, it's always the air crash which is more important. Okay, Mark, you must be thinking a lot of this is unfair. Now, you research yoga. You're a scholar of Sanskrit, and so some people would ask me, what business do you have to appropriate this culture?
Well, I don't think any of this conversation so far has been unfair, but I do think that the category of cultural appropriation can be a dangerous one and one that itself can be appropriated by different bases of power. And therefore, I think we have to proceed fairly carefully with it. Myself, I and Jim have just published a book called Roots of Yoga, which is a collection of translations from various languages, mostly Sanskrit, on yoga practice. And we had a session on Thursday, during which there was a question from the audience, which went like this: what are two white guys doing writing about yoga? It wasn't a question. There was another question there. It was understood, I think. There was a little flurry of applause. It was understood what that question meant. And it was that if you're not the right color, if you aren't born into a certain culture, then go away, hands off. Now, in the nature of the book, I think, is in some ways what Yassmin, you were saying, that in some ways it amplifies voices that have been lost. And hopefully, gives that a new lease of life. What I think that cultural appropriation, the idea of cultural appropriation can do is to reify certain groups. It can lead directly plug into a kind of identity politics that we see burgeoning across the globe. And in the hands of demagogues, it becomes a dangerous idea. So there's a kind of tension, a kind of dynamic in that that I think we have to be on the lookout for. And I would heartily agree that the essential thing is to arrive with a spirit of generosity and respect, and the kind of robust civility that Timothy Garton-Ash talks about. I'll just say one more thing about authenticity, that I've actually thought about this quite a lot with regard to the exportation of yoga and the development of yoga in other parts of the world, where I think there is a real anxiety about authenticity, especially for people who aren't born into communities where yoga is practiced, but now practice yoga and practice it very seriously. Authenticity, it seems to me, is always in some way constructed. And I don't think it's an anxiety that we see in those older texts, in the texts that we've been looking at. It certainly is something that people are worried about. And, well, maybe you wanted to say something.
So, what I'll say is not about the two individuals, Jim and Mark. Like, I think the interesting thing is that, yes, both of you have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort to understand the culturally different areas that you're studying and so on, which I deeply respect. And it's not a commentary either about the book you've written. But what it is a commentary on is, the fact is there are probably many people who aren't two white blokes who are experts in yoga, and they don't get the opportunity to necessarily write a book and necessarily be as celebrated by the broader literary society in the same way that you do if you're two white blokes, which is what the comment was about earlier, is people love it when, like, some white American goes into Sudan and writes something about Sudan, but if it's the exact same thing written by a Sudanese person, it's actually not that interesting and actually not as celebrated. And so our experiences have to be translated through the lens of a Western context in order for it to be legitimate. And that is what sits so frustrating.
Yeah. So I think I'd be mostly in agreement with that. But I would once again say that using the category of cultural appropriation is a double-edged sword, and that what in fact we need to do is put more resources into empowering and enabling those voices, into, say, for instance, giving scholars access to materials, giving disenfranchised voices more of a say, and that is currently that kind of public funding is currently being gutted, and I think that is where the focus should be, the kind of evisceration of culture. That kind of cultural appropriation
I feel
is
the
very important.
appropriation of yoga has actually helped yoga. I mean, Indians behave as though, I mean, most of us do yoga and that everybody does yoga and that we have been doing yoga for the last 5,000 years. That's not true. If you ask a gentleman called Iyengar, I mean, our Prime Minister also talks about yoga. He does 2 asanas, during one of which he looks like he has a backache. His entire cabinet talks about yoga, okay? But you just look at them, okay, you feel that what they do is eating. They can barely touch their own toes. You know? And it took an Iyengar to break a very sacred code. He decided to teach yoga to foreigners, and then it was relatives, and as he says in his book, they wouldn't let him in. And then he started teaching it, and this is blasphemy, to white women. People thought that he was having an affair with all the women. So Iyengar says in his book, I got married. So he had to struggle to take yoga beyond the Indian male. And once the West took to yoga, it became fashionable, it came back to India, just like some Indian books which don't do well in India win the Man Booker and they become bestsellers in India.
But isn't that a commentary on the inequality in of itself? That we have to wait for other people, we have to wait for the Westerners to say this is a good enough thing before we ourselves value
it also implicates all of us. It also implicates the people in this
100%.
audience. It implicates
Like,
all of us.
I totally recognize that it's a problem that I personally struggle with. That I have to wait for somebody else to say it's legitimate. All the histories about Sudan that I've read are in English, written by Americans and Europeans. Like, it's something that I struggle with but we don't have the discussion within our own cultures about the fact that we've internalized it ourselves.
Yes.
Sorry.
Jim. Hi. Good morning.
Hi, Manu. Hello, everyone.
You can say anything you want.
Can I? Oh, dear. You may regret that. I might get myself in trouble. Yeah, well, I suppose one thing there are various things I could talk about in this context, but if we're talking about yoga, we'll pick that up. I mean, I'm going to make I probably will get myself in trouble here. I'm going to make a slightly facetious comparison, so bear that in mind before I make it. But when, it was a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, there was a big movement in America, a big movement, I mean, it had in our world, it was quite prominent, by an organization called the Hindu American Foundation, who launched a campaign to take back yoga, okay? And what I think, just to go sort of more broadly into a lot of these issues of cultural appropriation, they're often just sort of small incidents of culture being appropriated, moved around as part of much bigger political, geopolitical, globalizing flows, okay? And so yoga has gone to the West, and this in a process that's been nicely documented by Mark, by the way. As you say, it goes back and forth. There's a lot of interplay between yoga as practiced in India and yoga as practiced in the West. But the sort of complaint, in brief, of the Hindu American Foundation was that yoga had been taken from India, had been commercialized, and had been divorced of its purity, and was now being practiced by people in silly clothes who had no clue about the true essence, and that it should be taken back. Now, my facetious comparison, but I think it does illustrate a bigger point, is what about cricket? Okay, cricket, British invention. I think, well, there's some argument that perhaps it was first played in France. And over the last few years, India has become the power broker in the world of cricket. They've created the IPL, they've completely commercialized it, they've completely mutilated Test cricket, people playing cricket in silly coloured clothes. Can we have back our kind of quasi-spiritual tradition of cricket? Now, these are just huge flows that we can't fight against, and all we can do is kind of add our little piece to try and make people do it with more respect. I think in the case of cricket, it's a lost cause.
See, the coloured clothes, the Australians did that first.
Yeah, that is true. Sorry, yeah, no, well pointed out, yes.
I mean, that would work if India had colonized England, right? So what all of, and one of the things I will say is that I totally agree with and accept that historically cultures have always changed and borrowed from each other, right? If you look at the architecture in Jaipur, it's a combination of a whole bunch of different histories and civilizations. But what we forget, or what we ignore in the conversation around appropriation, and even the phrase cultural appropriation, I think we get stuck on the semantics of, but it's about the the fact that we're living in a society that is a product of colonization, and that like our identities haven't been separated from that yet, and what is valued in the world hasn't been separated from that yet. And so as young people, particularly as a young person of color growing up in the West, I have to, we battle this, what is good and legitimate and given value are the things that the colonizers have decided is good and given value. And I don't think that's good.
Mrinal, would you like to add to this?
So I was just thinking about, I think maybe there are two kinds of cultural appropriation. The appropriation word itself is a bit
Hostile, it's very
hostile.
aggressive.
But there is a positive appropriation which leads to a certain hybridization of something which is static and stagnant, and gives it a new bounce, a new kind of a set of DNAs which makes it bouncier. Like in case of yoga, you'll bear me out, it happened with the Nath Siddha Sampradaya in the medieval period when they hijacked the Patanjali yoga, and Gorakhnath and Machinder together made it their own and gave it to all the Ved-Bahya groups that did not subscribe to the ideology of the caste system and the Vedic cultures. And so we have the Sampradaya of yogis and yoginis, women, it set and liberated them in a way, because it spun a whole new ideology around, and then it gave rise to what I feel its most greatest contribution to us writers is poets like Kabir. Who talk about the yogic discourse in a language of weavers, of people who had hitherto been denied access to the purer, so-called purer version. And I thought that was a very positive cultural appropriation. Without that, we would not have had Iyengar. Yeah. Iyengar probably hijacked it from the Nathas.
So even before Jim and Mark, there were Indians who were appropriating yoga.
Exactly. And they were not Indians in the sense in which we are often given to understand these days. They were not Hindus. They were non-Hindus. So it was being hijacked possibly by people from whom ostensibly it had come.
Yes.
So that's all.
I'm going to,
Okay.
Can I say something to that? Yeah, just to go on to the process to look at yoga again, and cultural appropriation more broadly. And as I say, it's part of bigger political at the moment globalizational flows. But looking at the history of yoga, and to go back to this period you're talking about with the Nath yogis, recent research that we've done on manuscripts, by the way, which no one has looked at for 300 years. It's not as if there are other people looking at these manuscripts not being able to get published in their analysis of them. We're the only people who've looked at this, okay? And these manuscripts show that the earliest texts of Hatha Yoga were written by Buddhists, okay, Tantric Buddhists.
Right.
And this is a period of 11th or 12th century.
Right.
And then these practices and ideas get adopted. Meanwhile, Buddhism, for reasons that are not entirely clear, gets eradicated from India, but its cultural products remain.
Right.
So maybe in some ways, cultural appropriation is a good thing if at least some vestiges of these cultures remain, even if the rest of it's destroyed.
One small blame to accrues, and it comes in a very funny incident. A writer friend narrated to me, Lakshmidhar Malviya is a scholar who now lives in Tokyo, and he has rediscovered a lot of medieval writers of dialects, Brij Bhasha. He has discovered Dev. Now he told me about this terrible trip that he had. He went from Allahabad to Jhansi, across the river, where he was told the family members of Dev, the great Ritikalin poet, resided. He was in search of several manuscripts. So he cycled there, and it was pouring, he said, and then he knocked on the door, and after some knocking, somebody said, "Kaho," and then came out with a lantern, and he said, "I'm so and so, and I have come in search of manuscripts. I believe you have." He said, "But so, how much will you pay me for it?" So he quoted whatever he could, but he said, I was rather taken aback by the first question. He didn't even ask my credentials, why I was asking for those manuscripts. And he quoted whatever figure he could. And he said, "No, I'll wait for the white people to come and buy this. They'll pay me better rate." So there you are.
Ajay, you wanted to add something to yoga? And
I think to me, yoga as somebody says, yoga is a fashion now for fashion or the symbol of elite class. A well-off class. Actually, first we spoil our lifestyle and then we go to the yogacharyas. If we will not spoil our lifestyle, we are enjoying in the late nights and woke up at 11 o'clock, then we think, oh, we need yoga now. Otherwise, I think, why a blacksmith, why a laborer do not need any kind of yoga, and he is more fit than us physically. But we have made this a status symbol now, big gyms and yoga classes. I am remembering, as Mrinal ji said, Kabir's one line only. He said, and it is I think it's a nectar of his whole poetry. खोजी होए तो तुरता ही मिलिए, पल भर की तलाश में, सब सांसन की सांस में. The whole pranayam is based on this breath. You are controlling your breath, the all yoga has been done. So, what is the need of this yoga? You are paying for it. We must work out for at least 2 hours per day. We will not need any kind of yoga or gyms, but we will not do that. We will do another things. So this yoga, I don't think it's become again middle class and an upper middle class shosha.
I think sometimes
just a brief comment to say, it's wrong to say that all the poor are healthier than we are. It's wrong because I have done a book on the reproductive health of rural women, and it's in an abominable stage. 90% of women have morbidity of long-standing kind which goes untreated. So let's not create myths where we need to demolish myths.
I think these are physical problems, not the mental, psychological problems.
No, there are also mental problems.
But the people are going to the yoga are mostly suffering with psychological disorders.
Not. I think that's an exaggeration.
Get in trouble.
I know many people.
Let's do fasting to create more.
If you have a fit body, your mind is very good working.
So it looks like, Ajay, a lot of people with loud voices don't agree with you.
Yeah, it's okay. It's their right
Okay.
to be disagreed.
Can I
Yes.
add one final comment?
Yeah.
I'm going to take a moment from being the angry black woman. And essentially, yes, we will always, things will always move between cultures. But it is just the ideal that, having this conversation is working towards is that the exchange is equal. That what we, gain from others and then what we send from others, both are treated equally, both are seen as equal. And yoga going to the US, for example, that benefits Indians as well as anything that comes from America that comes here benefits the Americans. So that exchange is where we are truly sort of on a level playing field. But right now, the world is unfair. And I think the other interesting thing to note is that when I make comments about Western sort of the impact of Western society, whenever I talk about it to people who are Anglo, they take it very personally. And it is not to say that it is a slight against an individual, but it is about the fact that you are part of a group that has done something. In the same way that whenever something happens that a Muslim has done, I am supposed to somehow be responsible for it. But as a marginalized person, I don't get to be an individual. So that is something to take into account.
So I'd say perhaps one has to be careful about identifying groups such as Anglos. And I recognize the point that you're making with regard to power structures. Those power structures are changing. They're not the same as they were during the colonial period. There are other forms of colonialism.
Sure.
Just to say that, well, you know, I'm sitting here thinking, well, hang on. I live in a country that was occupied by the British for 800 years. I carry that passport of that country. My grandfather fought against the British. I have members of my family who went to jail as political prisoners because of the British. I think the problem with this kind of reasoning is that you identify, you think you know who somebody is. So I think a certain kind of care has to be taken with regard to those groups. That's
I'll accept that.
I feel sometimes outsiders can improve the art or literature of a society by just being outsiders. For example, when I was 20 years old, I was transferred to Bombay, and I noticed that all the stray dogs were twice the size of the stray dogs in Chennai, and nobody in Bombay had noticed that, because obviously they've lived with these dogs. And of course, I also noticed that Shiv Sena would start with patriotic songs at 10 in the night, and by 12, strangely, they had the habit of playing Barbie Girl. And all the political journalists in Bombay didn't notice it because they had lived with it. And I told them, see, Shiv Sena loves Barbie Girl. At 12 o'clock sharp, they start playing Barbie Girl. And then when they started listening, they agreed with me. I think the speakers now would also touch upon the improvements that an outsider can bring to a society by being outsiders. But before that, let's open the session to mentally imbalanced people who do yoga and others. Let me search for the craziest person. A person who looks crazy.
I was not
Yes.
saying this. I was talking about tranquility, the peace of mind, actually. you are misquoting me now.
So thank you. Yes, I'm absolutely crazy, and I'm crazy about animals and animal rights. And you know, one of the things that kept going through my mind is there's been this big debate in India that we've been all consumed with about the banning or the overturning of a ban on a what we consider a very cruel sport of Jallikattu. The ultimate shut up that is thrust at us is stay out of it, it's Tamil culture. And you know, is that not what it becomes? It's very convenient. Be it anything, it's just a very convenient, the ultimate convenient tool to say shut up, keep your nose out, when the truth is very, very inconvenient to face. And is that not what this is all about? Because slavery, you know, I mean, people have come and questioned, and yes, I think an outsider sometimes is able to, that distance is able to bring a perspective which is very, very valuable. Is this not the ultimate shut up
this
to...
question? Who wants to mark? Do you want to take this
Whom
question?
you are asking this question? No?
I mean,
Do you, is there anybody in particular you're asking this question to? Okay, to Mrinal. Okay. By the way, it's not Jallikattu, it's Jallikattu. Okay. We're talking about culture.
No, you're right. You know, I would think, you know, I would react like you do it. But then I come from the Himalayan region, which is right at the other end of India. And they can say you come from an area where there are no bulls like this, and there are no plains to fight them on, so what do you know about a bullfight? And frankly, I don't. But as a human being, my integrity demands that this sport be stopped. So I will say it will be stopped, not because I defy your culture, but because I think any good civilized culture would protest against cruelty to any living being.
and I also think that the excuse of culture is often used to keep things at the status quo. So we can go back to rights, right? Like so many things in Sudanese culture, for example, are excused because that's the way culture is and they suppress women or whatever it may be. But going back to the human rights framework is something that we can't question.
But is there still, there's a point here, is there still something Western about the organization of ethics? I know it sounds very complicated, but there is a certain ethics as an organized movement. Seems something very West European about it.
I mean, yeah, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yes.
I think all religions in the world forbid cruelty to other living beings, period.
That's not true. We've been eating animals for a very long time, and I
All
think
of
there's
us
a lot
eat
of
animals,
cruelty.
and the Brahmins in the north eat flesh. They even offer it to the goddess. So let's not, it's a food chain. That's a different matter altogether. But should we voluntarily and happily inflict cruelty on a creature who cannot talk back, who cannot resist, who we have completely in our control, is to my mind rather revolting thought.
Yeah, sorry. So I had a quick question for Yassmin, and if anyone else wants to jump in. So my issue with cultural appropriation is I feel like it gets, it interferes with allyship and making alliances. Like, just to give a quick example, there's this book called On the Run by Alice Kaufman, and she spent her entire PhD years in the hood in Philadelphia and did this excellent ethnographic account of what it's like, the whole experience of race and crime. And then a criticism of it was that she spent so much time trying to understand the context that she lost her objectivity. So do you see the struggle I'm talking about? Like,
I mean, so we were having a conversation about this yesterday, and I think there's definitely a case-by-case basis, right? So we can't just blanket say, that's cultural appropriation. If you try to write this, you can't, et cetera, et cetera. Like that, nothing works like that. I think what it comes down to is looking at the intention, looking at the amount of respect somebody has gone into doing something, but also the person themselves acknowledging their privilege in that process. So I think all of those things, like when we discuss social issues like this, I'm an engineer, so I wish there was like a black and white yes or no answer, but there isn't. And so we constantly have to be making sure that we are critically thinking about each situation and not blanket saying something is good or something is not good. But unfortunately, the way that the fast way that media works and the way that people want to outrageously respond to everything means that, you will get blanket criticized for anything. But I think usually what it is, it should be seen as the first point in a discussion.
Okay, we'll take, right next to the lady, right next to the gentleman. Yeah.
So my question, got it. So my question's for everyone on the panel, and Ajay, I'd love to know what you drank last night. But my question basically is, why can't the conversation around cultural exchange become positive? So for instance, in my opinion, the fact that the both of you can take something that is, Buddhist or Indian or, however its origin may be defined, to all over the world is awesome. So what will it really take to change the conversation from being negative and derogatory and almost, having a false sense of ownership to something that doesn't really belong, to any one person or any one ethnicity? What will it take to change the conversation?
Do you guys want to say something?
Me?
Who wants, yeah, can take it?
No. The question is
the
to
question
me or?
To
All of
anybody
us.
on the panel?
Yeah. Do you want to say something?
The question's to anyone, but I mean, it would be great to, have Mark or Jimma answer the question. What will
sorry,
it take to change
okay.
the discourse?
What will it take to improve the situation? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not optimistic. I think in these days of Twitter and social media, when anyone can just shout cultural appropriation at anyone, it's tricky. I mean, I think what it takes is for everyone, as Yassmin said, to judge each case on its merits. I think that the very fact that this term has appeared recently is a problem in itself. And just to give two examples, actually, recently, I think it was something a couple of years ago in the States where some company brought out some bikinis with Hindu gods on them or something. And that's clearly disrespectful, and I think it was pointed out to them and they stopped being produced. Meanwhile, I just heard that Sam Dalrymple, so our esteemed, one of our esteemed festival directors' children, has just started at Oxford University to read Sanskrit, make of that what you will. But at his induction week, he was wearing a kurta, and he was told he couldn't do that because that's cultural appropriation. And he said, look, hang on, I've grown up in India, I've been wearing a kurta all my life. So and a problem, I think, as well, that goes with that is cases like that are very much open to ridicule, and then, different groups, political groups, which perhaps we wouldn't want to arm with fodder, can go, oh, look at these snowflakes, whatever, they're being pathetic. So I hope everyone can judge, ideally every single case would be judged on its own merits and people wouldn't bandy this name around, but I'm not optimistic.
I would add to that for the case of scholarship. I mean, it's quite depressing times, really, for for scholarship, particularly, scholarship on yoga, for instance, where certain voices are really kind of shut down and others are brought forward. And I think what we see is a kind of history being subsumed under ideology often. And so I don't know what it would take, but certainly some kind of dedication to open conversation, as you say, and a kind of equal exchange as far as we can establish that.
What I would add to that is when people come out and say, I think that it's a fad because I should write whatever I want, that makes the people who feel like their culture is being appropriated defensive. And so both ends need to sort of take a moment to say, okay, I respect that there is something difficult happening here. Let's both be generous and acknowledge the fact that one side has to be more generous than the other and respect that in order for it to progress positively.
We have just a minute, so it has to be a very brief, sharp question. Yes? Who was close to the mic? Yeah. It has to be very brief, and the answer also, I'm sorry, it has to be a bit brief.
Any of the panelists can answer, all of you can answer. Okay. So do you really believe that cultural appropriation is a topic to be debated when over history we see that, Upanishads that were lost in India for thousands of years actually came back after having been translated into Persian and Greek? If we see Sharat Chandra Chatterjee, who was the greatest writer for women issues and women characters, was actually a man in a very man-dominated society.
We got it. Ajay?
Okay, first of all, dear friends, I want to take a U-turn on the issue of yoga as academicians usually takes. So I don't want to hurt your feelings. I didn't want to that. But I want to clear it. Yoga, if anybody want to do yoga, he or she can. I am not condemning, but I am just telling you that there is no need of yoga if you follow the real and spiritual lifestyle, spiritual in brackets. But we don't do that. Then we need medicines or yoga. If you walk daily for 50 minutes, you don't need any kind of yoga. But after that, if you want to do it, if you want to perform yoga, do it. But then you have to leave many things, late evenings and cigarettes, smokings and stuff, but you will not going to give up it. And you will go to yoga too, and you will go to bars too. And these both will, I think, this will make mess up. So that's why I am telling you, it is, if for the peace of mind you are doing performing this, it's okay, it's fine. And one more thing, I am not blaming also the upper caste writers, mainstream writers who had written about the Dalits, but the question was that they did not follow the Ambedkarite vision and thought in their writing, which is the main pillar of Dalit literature.
Great. On this note, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. Thank you, Manu Joseph, Jim Mallinson, Yassmin Magid, Mark Singleton, and Mrinal Pande for this interesting session. Thank you so very much. Ajay, Navaria, Jim Mallinson, and Yassmin will be signing the books. If you have their books, we will bring them to the author signing area and you can have your books signed.
ही आहे आजची ठळक बातमी. अहो ही 3 आहे जी तुम्ही रोज वाचता. कारण तुमच्या समोर येईपर्यंत कधी तिला डिवचलं जातं, घाबरवलं जातं, असामाजिक तत्वांच्या प्रभावाखाली कधी दाबलं जातं. अहो वाचायला मजा आली पाहिजे ना. मग मसाल्याचा छिडका, त्यावर मनोरंजनाचा तडका. मग काय, मुद्द्याचं ते कापलं जातं आणि आपल्या फायद्याचं ते छापलं जातं.
आता वेळ आहे स्वतंत्र विचारांची. आता वेळ आहे दिव्य मराठीची. दिव्य मराठी, महाराष्ट्राचे एकमेव स्वतंत्र वृत्तपत्र.
The program is designed to let students do that. They come in for an individual class, and in addition to which they spend a lot of time working in groups, training their ears, working at the studio, composing songs, or practicing for performance platforms which we set up for them outside school as well as within school. And we try and simulate as real world an environment as possible